The first trip with my crew, we had a fighter attack over the enemy coast, and it was quite persistent fighter, but we got away from him, and we got to the target area. We were running up on the bombing run. I got hit with flak on the port outer engine. The burst was very close. It felt like a direct hit. The aircraft was very badly damaged and went out of control, went into a tight spiral. Managed to regain control about 10,000 feet, and since the aircraft was still flyable, decided to get as far away from the target area as we could. And the choice then, because of the loss of fuel and the loss of the engine, we didn't have much choice. The ditching in the North Sea was out of the question. So we decided to head for occupied territory, which was France or Holland. We made a beeline for France, and eventually forced to bail out east of Metz, south of Luxembourg.
So you headed for occupied France, and
yeah, and
what's the order of bailing out of an aircraft?
All the rest of the crew go first. The pilot is last.
You're flying into Halifax.
Yeah.
One engine's out.
One engine's out. The wings badly damaged, and the German gunners had modified the aircraft to a point where it was almost impossible to fly. It went out of control, headed for the deck in a spiral. I was able to regain control, and at that point we decided to get as far away from the target area as possible because of the danger of bailing out in the target area. The possibility of trying for a ditching in the North Sea was out of the question because of the weather and the loss of fuel and loss of one engine. And the alternative would be to head towards Holland or France or Belgium, of course. Get as far as we could. We didn't have hardly any hope of ever reaching there, but we started off in that direction anyway, and managed to get as far as east of Metz, south of Luxembourg, in that area. I'm not exactly sure where. My parachute had been damaged, and as a chest-type pack, one of the clasps wasn't I couldn't engage it. Mm-hmm. So I had to try with just the one clasp on the pack.
How did you prepare the airplane for the bailing out?
I trimmed the aircraft as best I could, but it still wasn't very stable. It started doing all kinds of things on its own when I left my position, but I hurried to. Before I did that, I took we had an incendiary bomb for the purpose of destroying the aircraft in case of a landing in enemy territory. I activated the bomb by taking the top off and striking it on a piece of metal, I don't remember where, and threw it back in the oxygen supply. So I hurried to get out, and I decided that the best way, because of my damaged parachute, the best way to go out would be head first out through the hole. And I hung on to the two handles on the pack and kept hanging on to them until I decided that my feet were heading for the ground and my head was up. and I found the ripcord, pulled the ripcord, and the chute eventually opened, and with the one strap I kept spinning back and forth, and as I descended down through the cloud, it was snowing, and it was a wet snow, and it got wetter as I got closer to the ground. And eventually, it got lower still, it turned to sleet, and then eventually when I landed, it was actually raining.
How high were you when you bailed out? How high were you above the ground?
When I bailed it, when I got out, I'd be about 7,000 feet.
It's quite a height.
And after I landed, I decided, well, the first thing that I wanted to do was try and conceal my parachute so that they couldn't find it. But I wanted to have a piece of it because I felt that I didn't have enough clothes for the kind of weather that I was expecting. So I took my knife out of the little pocket in my flying boot and cut a good chunk out of the parachute before I concealed the parachute. And then I proceeded to look for a place to spend the rest of the night. This was after midnight. And
what was the date?
This was January the 20th, 1944. I found a place to hide. I found a barn some little distance away, and the idea was to hide and keep hidden for at least a day, because there would be a search, and the Germans would know there's a crash near hand, and they would initiate a search and try and find whoever they could. They did manage to get one of my crew, but they didn't get the rest of them. And
so how many was that got away?
There was 6 of us got away, and the 7th one was caught. And I found a barn, and luckily it was full of sheaves of grain, and I climbed up and got in the top and burrowed down into the sheaves and hid myself down there, and started to sort out what I had to make my escape. I got the escape aid out and took stock of what was in there. And this is where my flashlight from my May West was very handy. It was a good flashlight. And
what were the escape aids?
The escape aids, there was a map, and there were compasses. There's all kinds of compasses. The most useful one was the button compass that I had in the uniform. And that was the one that I relied on because it was easy to use. The others were almost a joke to try and use. There were needles that you would suspend, and we had some thread in the escape aid. You'd suspend the compass needle on a piece of thread and wait till it settled down, and then see which way north was and go from there. Well, that wasn't, I didn't think that was very practical. But at least it was something. If there hadn't been anything else, it was something that could be used. There were pap pills in the escape aid that you could take one if you felt depressed, or if you had a problem to try and get across a bridge that you thought might be guarded, and it was the only way to get across. You could take one of those. And I did. But I never took more than half one at a time. One other time I had to cross a river, and I used one then. I managed to find something that would pass for a boat, and a piece of driftwood for a paddle, and I got across a river that way. But Anyway, I going back a little bit on the story. I found a barn to hide in, and sure enough, there was a search, and the Germans did come into the barn, but it was I think a half-hearted sort of search. They probably, certainly if they'd known I was there, they could have found me.
Mm-hmm.
But I made it as difficult as I could, and that passed, and I stayed there for a whole day, and eventually I had myself sorted out pretty well, and I started off from there and headed west. I used the map and I used the button compass, and after traveling for some time, I approached a farm family. It was there on the edge of a small village, and they're all farmers in the little villages there. And they were very frightened. They couldn't put me up. They couldn't help me any more than giving me some food. And so I was glad to take that. They gave me bread and wine, and they gave me some salt pork, pickled pork, and that was good. I needed some food at that time.
Did they know who you were?
I told them who I was. I had studied my French when I was hidden in this barn. And so I said, Je suis un aviateur anglais, descendu par le décision allemand. And I didn't say it quite that good, but they understood what it was. And I told them I was hungry. And when you tell a Frenchman you're hungry, you have to be very careful how you pronounce the word femme, whether it's girl or hunger. One is femme and the other's femme. And anyway, I left there, and I traveled mostly at night, especially in places where there wasn't much cover. I think probably the next thing I did was stole somebody's bicycle, and that got a good bit of ground behind me. And the next attempt that I made to try and get help was at a farmer or a miller. He seemed to have a grist mill, and I asked for help there, and he was very belligerent, and possibly more frightened than belligerent too. But his advice was to give myself up to the Germans at the first opportunity, and there was no other help, and that was the only help that he could give me. And I had strong suspicions that he was going to turn me in. So I got out of there as fast as I could and put as much space between him and me as I could. And I headed for a swampy area. And I stayed in this swamp for the rest of the day. This was actually in daylight. Stayed in this swamp for the rest of the day, and I could see what I was sure was a patrol searching the area. And I couldn't think of any other reason why they would be there, and I was sure they were Germans. So at night, I left there and made my way along a little further, and I got into a First World War trench. And it was quite interesting. I spent the night there and part the next day, and I found all kinds of artifacts, or what I called artifacts. There was a piece of leather shoes, and tin cans, and things like that. And this trench was quite a deep affair and quite wide. But I didn't want to stay there too long. I got on the road again and headed towards this little village, Marson-sur-Marne. That was where I really got my first help. The chap there he had a wife and a little baby. The baby was only about a month old. I listened outside their window, and this was getting on towards midnight, and I could hear the baby crying, and I listened out at the window and determined that they were talking French, because I didn't want to knock at a house where they're all German. And when I determined they were French, I went around to the door and knocked on the door, and he came to the door and rather startled, and again I told him who I was. And he, after consulting with his wife and wondering what to do, he eventually invited me in, sat me down and left. And he came back in a very short time with possibly 5 or 6 other people. Now, I expected that they would be resistance people, and I'm sure they were. The reason for them being there was to try to find out if I was really who I said I was, because at this time the Germans were posing as escaping Allied airmen and catching the French helpers in this way. But one of these people was the mayor of the village. Another one was, his name was Andre Hermant, and another one of the people was called Mimi. Mimi was a great big fellow. I suppose he'd be the one that would do the dirty work if I was a German. But anyway, they interrogated me, and not one of them spoke English. But with signs and with this paper that I had in my hand and their observations, they decided I was okay, so away they went. At this point, Joseph smiled and he said, "Sit down," and they gave me some food, which I really needed at this time. But what I needed more was what he brought next, was a bottle of eau de vie. Eau de vie is it's distilled apple juice, and it's very powerful and not very palatable, but certainly welcome. And we sat down at the table. Now, at this time, it's getting on for probably at least 1 o'clock in the morning. So Joseph and I went to work on this bottle and talking away, and neither one knowing what the other one was saying. But eventually, before the bottle was empty, Joseph was completely fluent in English, and I was completely fluent in French. So we got along great.
What was Joseph's last name?
Belloil.
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 This is the fellow whose home you...
He was the first Frenchman who really helped me.
Right.
He gave me food and drink and a nice bed, a really nice bed. I appreciated that. And they put me to work, something to do while I was waiting for him to arrange contacts with the resistance. They gave me a bushel of lentils, and lentils, you know what they are. I never pronounced the word right, but you know what they are anyway. And I was to sort out these lentils. Well, it was a great big bushel basket, and I went to work on it, and I was supposed to sort out the weed seeds and the mouse shit from the lentils, and this hand, all I had was pure lentils, and the rest was the garbage. But I worked away on that, and I did pretty good, far better than I thought I would. And I think by the time I left there, I was almost all finished. But eventually Joseph led me away from there on 2 bicycles towards Chalon-sur-Marne. He took me to a priest in Chalon, and the priest, he dropped me there, and I was just a very brief time with this priest. I'd even forgotten that I'd been there until I read Joseph's letter. Just the other day here, reread one of his letters. Then after that, the priest took me to, or sent for somebody, and I was taken to the apartment of a teacher in Chalon. And she was away during the day, but she gave me a little carving that had been started, but and a picture of Jesus and the cross, and a carving knife, and that was my occupation during the day. Sit there doing this carving. I did quite well with the carving. I've never done any since, but I did pretty good with it. Anyway, from there I was taken to another place, to a farmer and his wife, Pierre and Pierrette. That wasn't the real names. I tried not to know anybody's name from the time I left Joseph. After that, I tried not to know anyone's name because of the danger of being able to, if the Germans interrogated me, I wouldn't know the names of the people that helped. So in a lot of cases, in most cases, in fact, if I heard a name, it wouldn't be a real one, it would be a phony name. Anyway, I stayed with these people for a while, and then eventually I was moved away from there and went to another place towards Soissons, and here I met a French policeman who was escaping from the Germans because of his activities, and him and his nephew, and so we're tied in with these people, and got somebody now to travel with. And at this time, I met my engineer, and later on some of my other crew members, and we traveled. Am I forgetting something here that's important?
What was your reaction when you met your crew?
Oh, surprise. I didn't expect to see them again. I thought they'd probably all be prisoners. But I was happy to see them, and so we traveled on towards Paris with many stops and many dangerous little situations. In Paris, it was
a dangerous situation.
Where the Germans would just about catch up to us, and even though they probably didn't know us, they were right beside us, sort of thing.
Were these just chance encounters, or? Chance
encounters, yeah. Maybe not all chance encounters, but because there were a lot of collaborators in France, and you had to be very careful about them too. Although the French people in general, I had a great regard for them. I often wondered, would I do the same for them if our roles were reversed? But Anyway, eventually we got to Paris, and then there was quite a few times when we'd have to skip out the back door or up onto the roof, and in Paris seemed to be full of Germans, even though they weren't all looking for us, of course, but eventually after some attempts, we got to the station that led south, and on the way down, our destination was going to be Toulouse. But on the way out of Paris, somewhere down the line, and I don't know where it was, the train stopped as it was going into the station, and there was a gun battle took place, but we weren't involved in this gun battle, but we thought it best to evacuate the train and get out of there, and we all dispersed. But we always had a plan. We know which direction, we know where we're going. So at the other end of the town, we'd regroup there, and so this is what we did. And in this town, this was where the passing through there was a large German army marching up the street singing Lily Marlene, and I thought they did it beautifully. They were just singing it. There was no music to it. Just their singing, and they could really sing. And
you were given papers, were you, by the underground?
Yes, I had gotten this. The other thing I had gotten back in Chalons, where I was at this teacher's place. I stayed there long enough for them to get me a false ID paper, and my name there was Francois Gardon. I'm not sure about the last name. I'm sure about the first name. But I had photos in my escape aid, photos for the ID card, and so that worked out great. And then when after we got down into Vichy area, had to have a different passport, different ID card. So in order to get the photos for that, went into Toulouse and to a machine and had the pictures taken on the machine. And they made us ID cards.
What was your occupation that they gave you?
Forgeron, a blacksmith. Yeah. And I was born in Bayonne, France. Anyway, it was at Toulouse. It wasn't safe to travel any further because of the patrols and the snow conditions in the mountain. Of course, we weren't really close to where we might try to make an attempt to get across the mountain. But we found a farmer up in the hills that would help, and he'd let us stay in one of his buildings, a stone building, not too far away from his barn. In his barn, he kept a yoke of oxen, and he came every day to take these oxen out to work somewhere. What he did, I don't know, but he brought us food every morning when he'd come to get his oxen. And we were there for quite a while.
How many were in this group?
In this group now, there were the two Frenchmen, the escaping policeman, and his nephew, and there was 3 of my crew, and I think that's all.
So there's 6.
And eventually, it became safe to travel further, and we went to Toulouse, and this time to take the train towards Pau. Our destination was Pau, but we weren't going all the way to Pau on this train. I was with the younger Frenchman, the nephew, And he bought my ticket, and the rest were together, and they went in a different area of the train. But Reain and myself, we picked a coach that was completely occupied by German soldiers. And I just felt like turning and running, you know, but you can't do that. And anyway, we went on in. He was ahead of me, and went on into this coach. And when the conductor came to look at my ticket, I was certain that he knew who I was. He looked at me, and I looked right back at him, and you got that feeling that he knows what's going on here. But anyway, everything was okay, and we got out at the at our destination. I forget where that was, but again we were separated there, and or we were still separated because the others were in another part of the train. And Reain and myself, he knew where we were going, and I didn't, but he did. And we grouped up just about Pau. Pau was in the foothills of the Pyrenees. We grouped up in the area there, and this other new group that we were with decided to make an attempt at crossing the Pyrenees. We're quite a ways from the high Pyrenees there, but going up through the foothills, were spotted by a German patrol, and they had dogs, and they captured most of the group, but I wasn't one that was captured. So again, we're dispersed, and the underground, or the resistance people, got hold of us, and very shortly we're reunited with the rest of the crew and the rest of the group, and we were taken to a big house in Pau. We stayed in this house for quite a while, waiting for the snow conditions in the mountain to be such that we could travel. And eventually the crossing was organized, and there was a fairly large group. I think there were probably about 10 of us, or maybe even more.
What would the date be?
That date, I don't know. That was March, sometime in March, anyway.
So
and there was a lot of snow on the mountain, but it wasn't. It had been worse earlier, and there was no storms expected. As we traveled up the mountain, this was all prearranged. We got to a shepherd's barn, and that's a fair distance up, and he had sheep. And the idea was to milk a sheep, drink the milk, which we did. I helped him milk a sheep, and there wasn't anybody else in the group that could milk sheep, but I was from a farm background, and I'd never milked a sheep before, but I knew the principle. And so anyway, we milked these sheep and drank the milk. And then, to foil the dogs and the patrol, we drove the sheep up the mountain as far as they could go until the snow got too deep. And he took them back, and we continued on up the mountain. And in about 3 days, we arrived at Isaba in Spain.
How were you dressed?
Oh, I wasn't dressed very warmly, I'll tell you that. One place, way back when I first started out, I found an old beat-up coat in a barn, and I wore that. And later on, I in a village, I broke into this little store where I thought I could find some clothing, which I did, and that allowed me to get rid of my uniform.
on your feet?
My feet, I wore sabots. Joseph gave me a pair of wooden shoes, and these wooden shoes I wore all the way up into the Pyrenees. And they were the worst damn things you ever saw. You'd take one step forward and you'd go two back, because they were like skis, yeah. They were great going down the other side, though.
You had some sheep. What else did you eat on your
Wait.
trek?
Well, while we were down in the Po area, my engineer and I were out sort of strolling in the hills there, a nice day, and the sun was shining good, and we discovered this big old snake that had just come out of hibernation. He was a little bit groggy, and we killed him, and skinned him, gutted him, and cut him up, and made stew. We ate snake. I never heard of anybody eating snake till then, but now it's a popular dish out in Arizona and Texas.
Your engineer accuses you of...
Before that, we'd gotten this rabbit from a farmer and cooked the rabbit, and he accused me of eating too much of the rabbit and leaving none for him. He said, I even picked it. I left him to pick the teeth. Anyway, so after that, I was imprisoned in Spain for some time, and while in prison there, I asked one of the young ladies that had sort of served table, as you call it that she could speak French, and by this time I could ask for anything I needed in French, and I asked her for a primary school book like you would have in kindergarten, and she got me one of those, and I proceeded to try and learn Spanish, thinking that eventually I'd get out of there and I might be able to use some of that information, and it worked out quite good. Yeah. So eventually, from there, the guard came to me one night and said, "You," and he named the others, "be at this door at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, right at 7. Make sure you're there." And yeah, we did that, and he was there too. And just before 7, he wheeled around and went way up the passage, left us there, and just then the door opened and there's an Englishman stuck his head in. "All right, fellas, come with me." And we went with him down to the little railroad station, a little narrow gauge railroad there, and got on this. The train was at the station, and there's only about 3 or 4 cars, and it's a little mountain railroad, And we got aboard, and this little thing goes whistling down the mountain there with his little whistle screeching away, scaring all the animals around. And that took us down into Pamplona. Pamplona, we had a good meal there, and I think we did an overnight in a place called Fonda Pascalina, and eventually this Englishman came back, and he had a driver and an old car. The old car for instead of gasoline, because gasoline was almost non-existent, he had a great big bag on top of the car, and inside the car, or in the trunk area, I guess, they had a gas generator. They heated this coal. I think they heated the coal with wood and captured the gas off the coal, and used that to run the engine. They did the same thing in southern France too. And so we went with this car to a place called Alhama. It's a mountain, had been a mountain resort before the Spanish Civil War, and they were just maybe trying to start back into business because the Civil War had just nicely ended when the Great War started. And in this resort, and went to at the desk, the clerk said, "Here's 800 pesetas for each of you, and go out and spend it." There wasn't all that much to spend it on, but we spent her anyway. And he said, "There's lots more." He said, "Come when you spend that, come back and I'll give you some more." Anyway, we had these hot baths there, and really had an enjoyable time there for a few days. Probably only a couple of days. I don't remember. It seemed a little longer. And eventually, this Englishman came back with another car. I think it was a different one this time. And we headed off towards Madrid. And I guess about a day and a half later, and 10 flat tires later, we eventually got to Madrid, and they put us up in the Hotel Mediodía, not too far from the British Embassy. And they fed us pretty good there, and we were free to travel around Madrid during the day, go to bullfights, and, well, there was only one bullfight, and just do what we liked. And there was more money available, which we were glad to use. And so eventually it was arranged that we took a train from there to La Línea. And La Línea is the place right across on the Spanish side from Gibraltar. From La Línea, we had to walk across through the barrier and into Gib. And looked after us pretty good in Gib, but the very next morning, we got there at night. The very next morning, they called me on the tannoy and said, be down at the wharf at such and such. I didn't even know where it was. Be down there. It was too early for me anyway. But I went down, and they put me on a PBY, and I'm second pilot on this thing out to patrol across the South Atlantic for 14 hours. So I don't know if we're the whole 14 hours, but that's what it was supposed to be. So that was the reason for that was they got to get these pilots back in the air just as soon as possible, because I'd been away from flying too long. Well, I didn't think it was too long, but I guess they did. So then from there we got a BOAC DC-3 that was coming back from Egypt, and it was a freighter, and there was space for a couple of us on that. So my engineer and I got on that, got back to England, and went through MI9 in London, and actually I got a little bit of leave there, and